Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Israel is redefining land ownership in the occupied West Bank.
This is final, this is definitive, this is maybe the last step towards annexation. It is effectively annexation, just minus the name.
But as an occupying power, can Israel make permanent changes to land ownership? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. Hi. So before we continue with today's show, we want to hear from you. How do you see this latest move in the occupied West Bank, and what questions do you have about where things go next? Leave us a comment and tell us what stories you want us to cover in the future. And if you're listening on a podcast app, leave us a review and tell us where you're tuning in from. And by the way, a 5-star rating doesn't hurt either.
My name is Nida Ibrahim. I'm Al Jazeera's correspondent in the occupied West Bank, and I'm speaking to you today from Doha.
Nida, welcome back to The Take. So you've spent months reporting on how Israeli policy is reshaping life in the occupied West Bank, from settlement expansion to permit systems and restrictions on movement. And a lot of what we're talking about today kind of connects directly to your reporting. So I'm hoping this conversation can help us connect some of those dots. So we'll start with the news. Israel has approved restarting land registration in the occupied West Bank for the first time since 1967. Now, it sounds technical. It's a formal settlement of title process that allows Israel to register vast tracts of land and then open them up for settlement. And it's really these settlements of Israelis on Palestinian lands that are at the heart of the matter here. They are illegal, and they have made a two-state solution almost impossible. So I was thinking, before we unpack the new policy itself, can you give us a very basic overview of what the occupied West Bank looks like at the moment, the various zones, and maybe how these settlements are, in your words, changing the geography of Palestine?
Well, if you go to the occupied West Bank right now and take a tour, you'll find yourself in a massive building workshop. Not for Palestinians, but for the benefit of Israeli settlers. You see bulldozers digging and widening up roads. You see new illegal Israeli settlement units being built. You'll see more and more Israeli checkpoints being put as Palestinians are trying to make their way from one city to another. It's apartheid that you can see while you are driving on the roads. You can see how there are specific roads that are renovated, set up for the benefit of the Israeli settlers to connect these illegal Israeli settlements with one another. While at the other hand, you'll see the rundown Palestinian roads, the fact that there are villages that are hiding behind Israeli-built fences, Israeli-built walls. This all is a regime that is meant to displace Palestinians out of their lands one way or another. So wherever you look, you'll see an Israeli tactic, an Israeli strategy, an Israeli way to tell Palestinians, you are not welcomed here. To pack up your stuff and leave. And I've been covering the plight of Palestinian Bedouin communities, who are part of the most vulnerable communities in the occupied West Bank. And they've been living in these lands for decades, trying to graze their sheep, trying to make the dairy for the rest of the Palestinian society. But now they're facing impossible choices, protecting their children from settler attacks or staying on their lands. And unfortunately, they're choosing to leave. It's not really a choice, but they are leaving the lands they've known to be home for decades and going to other places that they know are not going to be safe. So it's a continued cycle of displacement that Palestinians have been facing. And these tactics and the latest land registration is part of a broader policy of dispossessing and displacing Palestinians.
The move means large tracts of Palestinian land could be confiscated and recorded as Israeli state land. Registration of land establishes permanent ownership. International law, states and occupying power cannot confiscate land in occupied territories.
So when the Oslo Accords were signed between the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, and Israel back in the 1990s, the Palestinian occupied West Bank areas were divided into 3 territories: Area A, Area B, Area C, where Area C is around 60% of the occupied West Bank, where Israel has full security and civil control. Now, we have Palestinians living there, but you can talk about 99% of building permits that have been submitted by Palestinians to the Israeli authorities in Area C. Those 99% of requests have been rejected by the Israeli authorities. So you have a vast population living there that cannot expand, that cannot build, that cannot live. And at the same time, you see Israeli settlements flourishing and expanding in Area C. Now let's talk about Area B, where there's some sort of a joint security and civil control divided between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli authorities. And Area A is where most of city centers are, and the Area A should be under the full control of the Palestinian Authority.
Sure.
But of course, as we've been saying for years, Israel does not respect this classification and has been provoking Palestinians in Area A, Area B, Area C as well.
Okay, so A, full Palestinian, B is half and half, and C is under Israeli control. And that is sort of the focus of our conversation, is those C areas. Under this new decision, a new land registration apparatus in the Israeli Justice Ministry will start surveying currently unregistered or public land, what they call public land. And the burden will then be on Palestinian inhabitants to prove ownership of that land. So let's talk about how this will work. Just how burdensome will this be? And what happens if someone lacks this necessary paperwork?
So let me just clarify a point. What we're talking about today is private Palestinian land, privately owned lands. And not all Palestinians, in fact, we're talking about 70% of lands in the occupied West Bank that have not been officially registered with the government. With the state, let's call it, because as we know, Palestinians have been under occupation, have been under different kinds of rules. So there was no point where these lands have been registered officially. What's happening today is that Israel is opening these systems and saying to everyone, you need to prove your ownership to the land in order for us to register it under your name. And if you fail to do so, then we will take it and turn it. Of course, they're not saying that, but effectively what it means is that they will turn it into Israeli state land. Now, the only problem with that is that Israel is an occupying power. And under international law, it is not the entity that is that is responsible for doing the land registration. Why? Because it's a final process that will determine ownership, and that will enable Israel to strip so many Palestinians and dispossess them from their lands and turn them into Israeli state land. The danger in that is that Israel has been turning almost all of the lands that it considers as state land into illegal Israeli settlements.
Why is it so difficult to prove that you would own the land? I mean, some of these records would go back to the Ottoman era. And then who would be the one who would actually look at the paperwork and make that decision?
So now it would be the Israeli civil administration or the Israeli army looking at these papers and deciding who owns what. That's one part of the problem. The second part of the problem is because during the Ottoman rule over Palestine, Palestinians who owned lands did not want to go through this expensive and tedious process of land registration, or that they feared that they would be subjected to high taxation. So they opted not to register land. So now they might find it difficult to find the paperwork to prove it, even though if you go to the village, everyone knows who owns the land. And there's some sort of a parallel system on the side that proves ownership, but it was never that land registration system with the state or with the government that was controlling the Palestinians. Another danger is what we call the absentees, because there are many Palestinians who lost their right to live in Palestine after Israel's military occupation, so they cannot be physically present. And Israel could say that because they are absentees and they are outside of the country, then they have no right to claim to this land. So again, that's another way of dispossessing Palestinians. Another issue is the forgery, because Israeli settlers have been trying to purchase lands in the occupied West Bank and have been forging paperwork to prove that they own the land. And combined with the decision that was taken by the Israeli government 2 weeks ago, saying that Israeli settlers can purchase land in Area A, B, or C, in the future, we might see this legal dispute between Israeli settlers. Again, under any future political settlement, these settlers should not be existing in Palestinian land. But once this land registration becomes final, then there would be no power that would be able to get these illegal Israeli settlements or settlers outside of Palestine in a future two-state solution. And here becomes the danger.
Nida, one political analyst told Al Jazeera this amounts to annexation by bureaucracy. You did a piece recently on permits, the use of permits, how an entire village suddenly needed military permission just to reach nearby towns, how restrictions made daily life just so difficult. And it shows you that control can come in many forms, not only tanks or raids, but also through paperwork. So can you talk about how that control manifests for Palestinians living under this occupation, how it seeps into every facet of life?
Yes, it's important to realize that this land registration is definitive and it's final, and it will change facts on the ground by an occupying power that under international law is illegally there, according to the 2024 ICJ ruling. So we are talking about an entity that is trying to create facts on the ground that is not entitled to do it. So again, this is not just bureaucracy. This is why political analysts are saying this is annexation, because you are effectively applying Israeli rules, Israeli ministries' oversight in the occupied West Bank that is supposed to be an occupied territory. Of course, Israel, since its occupation in 1967, has not been calling this occupied territory. They say words like contested, and they've been already dealing with the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, the name that Israel gives for the occupied West Bank, and dealing with it as Israeli land. So we're seeing now kind of like the paperwork that backs what Israel has been doing on the ground. So the decision itself does not come far from Israel's practices on the ground. We talk about this illegal Israeli settlements that have been expanding. We talk about water resources that have been attacked by the Israeli forces. We talk about the Israeli settlers who've been displacing hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian families from the lands they've only known. And even when they go to a second place, they're not safe there either. And I'm coming from a very pessimistic place that I don't see much changing on the ground. Like, I lived in my hometown is in Bethlehem, where yet another new illegal Israeli settlement has been, it's an outpost that was later recognized, and it's expanding on a land that used to be a park where we as children used to play there, and now it's being taken over by settlers who are intimidating the neighbors. So it's wherever you go, wherever you look, there's a new story of suffering and pain by the Israeli occupation that, again, makes people feel that they're so alone and so vulnerable and left dealing with one country that it has the support of the US and is doing whatever it likes, and it's behaving as a state above the law.
Yeah, and it's explicit. I mean, according to Israeli media, Israeli Minister of Finance Bezalel Smotrich, who submitted the proposal to restart land registration alongside Minister of Justice Yariv Levin and Minister of Defense Israel Katz, said the move was a continuation of the settlement revolution to control all our lands. We'll have more with Nida after a break. So, Nida, let's talk about the reaction to this new policy. What has the Palestinian Authority said about this decision? And do officials see this as something that they can actually push back against, or is it mostly a symbolic condemnation?
Unfortunately, it is a symbolic condemnation by the Palestinian Authority, by the Palestinian President's office that has released a statement saying that they condemn it, that they call and urge the international community to intervene. I can tell you that there's a lot of disappointment amongst Palestinians, not only from their leadership, but also from the world. And they say the world that enabled Israel to continue with its genocide for more than 2 years is not going to pay attention to the plight of Palestinians as they are losing lands and losing Palestine as we speak. And I've seen it in so many towns, Palestinians trying to leave to try and find a better place for their children to live in, because the settler attacks have been more brazen.
It takes just seconds for Israeli settlers to upend another Palestinian family's lives, and these attacks have been going on for decades. But since the war on Gaza, they've become more brazen and not shy about owning up to their crimes. Revenge. High from the hilltop youth, the Hebrew graffiti says. That's what the settlers often call themselves.
dispossession has been on steroids, and the fear, if you drive around the West Bank, is real. Even for us as journalists, it's not as the same. We cannot go to the same places that we used to go before. We have colleagues who have suffered massive attacks by the Israeli settlers.
This is Al Jazeera cameraman Lu'ay Saeed running for his life.
Every time you jump or you run fast, I saw someone trying to catch me. At one moment, I said, I will not run again. I'm done. I cannot run again. So I just sat on my knees. And then someone of my colleagues, he said, you have to keep going. They were tall and huge with masks. They were organized.
And this is the Israeli goal, to create an environment that will get Palestinians to voluntarily migrate. But there's nothing voluntary about that when every single aspect of your life, including your time, your access, your paperwork, your health, your ability to see your family, is controlled by Israel. And there's also, at the same time, another wave of Palestinians who are saying, you know, we're staying. We're staying not only because this is our land, but we're staying because we have nowhere else to go.
So this story isn't only being watched inside the occupied West Bank. The reaction from the outside has been immediate, and maybe nowhere more so than in Jordan. King Abdullah met in London on Monday with former UK officials and members of parliament. And actually, according to the royal court, he warned that Israel's illegal actions aiming to consolidate settlements and impose sovereignty over Palestinian lands undermine efforts to restore calm and risk escalating the conflict. I mean, this is a strong reaction from the Jordanians. What do they see here? Why are they treating it as more than just another policy change?
Because this is final, this is definitive, this is maybe the last step towards annexation. It is effectively annexation, just minus the name. Jordan has been in control of the occupied West Bank in the area, in the time era between 1948 and 1967, pre-Israel's occupation to the territory. And it was indeed Jordan that started the process of land registration as a way to prove ownership and to protect the lands of the Palestinians. And I think we are talking about 30% of lands that were registered, but that leaves us with so much more that needs to be done in order to do that. And Israel has frozen that when it occupied the West Bank under the pretext of that so many people have fled and were displaced and they cannot prove their ownership. So what Israel is doing is irreversible facts on the ground that will prevent any possibility for a future Palestinian state. And if Jordan and the other countries are not seeing the core and the danger of that, then that would be a problem. On the contrary, I think Jordan sees the danger because it's a massive blow to the two-state solution and to the security of the region. You are dispossessing and displacing Palestinians day in and day out. So it's one way Jordan is trying to push back as a country that has relationships with Israel. But it looks like Israel does not really care about this pushback, not from Jordan, not from Egypt, not from any other even international country. And that's where the danger is, that Israel is acting as a state above the law. And it is the duty and responsibility of the international community to hold it accountable, whether it's from the Arab states or from the world in general.
I mean, you spend so much time in the West Bank. Everyone is talking about how this is one step closer to full annexation. How is that different than what we're seeing today?
Well, let me give you an example. Israel annexed, occupied East Jerusalem. Even though under international law, it is still part of the occupied West Bank and it is under Israeli occupation. What Israel has been doing in Jerusalem is expanding the illegal Israeli settlements there to the extent that if you ask Israeli settlers inside if they know that they are on occupied territory, they would deny it because they think they are part of Israel proper. Everything is built in a way that would make you believe that you are in Israel proper. Israel has not only taken lands and dispossessed Palestinians from them, but they have built an Israeli separation wall that annexed and took lands into Israeli territory. And again, the Israeli goal of annexation is to take the land, but not the people. So they will try and dispossess and take and grab more lands from Palestinians and leave them cornered, leave them pushed, leave them isolated in a way that will suffocate any future national project for them, that they will have no rights, that they will need to leave. And that's the core problem, that what Israel has been doing in silence for so many years is now being loud and clear. They have no intention of giving Palestinians any of their rights.
There have been warnings of possible Israeli escalation during Ramadan. And we've seen these kind of escalations in previous years. There's also an increase in expulsion orders against Jerusalemites. I mean, how might this news coming right now, this latest move in the West Bank, shape the mood or the dynamic on the ground during this sensitive period?
Well, Palestinians are tired, I can tell you that. They're exhausted. They've been seeing their fellow Palestinians being bombarded day in and day out, and the world sat and did nothing. What Israel is trying to do now is use the holy month of Ramadan to say that we are deploying more troops to the occupied West Bank. It's a time where tension rises, and it's the time where Palestinians are going to revolt. But it does not take into consideration the amount of pressure it places and puts on Palestinians for them to explode and ultimately try and do something to change their reality. So yes, we might be seeing tension in the occupied West Bank, but we need to keep remembering that the reason for this tension is that Israel is putting Palestinians in a place that brings them to a boiling point and then looks at them and says, look, they have exploded.
These changes are happening step by step, one permit, one road, one legal process at the time. I wonder, do you think that's the way to understand this moment, that it's not what this policy does, it's what it portends? And I guess if you agree with that, based on your experience covering these policies, what will you be watching for as this plays out?
I think we'll start seeing more and more Palestinians losing their lands on a daily basis, but that will not make the major headlines. And it will be difficult to report on each and every person losing their rights to their lands. But for every Palestinian, for every person who's losing their lands, this is this is a catastrophic, this is a continuation of a cycle of displacement that started in 1948. But I fear that these personal stories and these anecdotes and these troubles that are facing Palestinians will not make it to global headlines.
Yeah, it'll be a bureaucratic version of the humiliations and assaults that happen every single day all over the West Bank.
And I fear that it will be normalized. And that's the main risk.
Nida Ibrahim, good to have you back in Doha temporarily. And thank you for coming on The Take today.
Thank you so much for having me.